Namaste. There are unique challenges which come in the course of taking a spiritual life, just as there are typical challenges when you lead a life which is what is called as the usual round of desires. The usual round of desires and egoism is a life which is primarily centered around selfishness. But in spiritual life, we are meant to get past this selfishness, this egoism, and ultimately the ego itself. So sometimes, because of this, there may appear a need in the being of becoming a martyr because we feel if I should not be selfish, therefore, people become a martyr. It's a natural tendency. In some people who are quite sensitive, so they become sensitive to the suffering of others. And in trying to assuage their suffering, they start taking it upon themselves. Now, is this a correct attitude? And we have a wonderful passage of the mother. And I would read that. She says, the only way to relieve others, to eliminate a little suffering in this world, is not to allow any sensitivity, however painful it may seem, to arouse suffering in yourself or to disturb your peace and serenity. So, meaning thereby, if somebody is suffering, we respond with pity. And in that excessive pity, we tend to take that upon ourselves. She says that is not the way. On the other hand, the idea of the work to be accomplished is itself warped by the illusion of personality. I am the one who is going to draw this suffering into myself. The correct idea is not to draw all suffering to yourself, which is unrealizable. So, what is to be done? Because you can't see people whom you love, cherish, and even otherwise, this suffering which is there. So, what do you do in that case? He says, the correct idea is not to draw all suffering to yourself, which is unrealizable, but to identify yourself with all suffering in all others, to become in it and in them a seed of light and love, which will give birth to a deep understanding, to hope, trust, and peace. So instead of drawing it into yourself, you sow seeds of light, of hope, of love. It's like a minor surgery, but that's what is important. So one way is that we try to run away. Oh, this is too much for me. We can't take it. So there is jugupsa. The other is we are drawn by pity and we take it upon ourselves. She says, no, even while you are there, you understand that suffering is there and know the deeper causes, and there sow a seed of light. In fact, that's what compassion is. Compassion, unlike pity is at the same level. You begin to feel, oh, poor fellow, that's pity. It doesn't help. It only drags you into the suffering. It's adding to the burden of suffering in the world. But compassion is where you look at it from above, you understand the real reason, and you act from above to relieve it. So, this is the big difference and shift that takes place in a spiritual life. Until this is well understood, the taste for sacrifice rises in your being, and each time an opportunity for it appears, since you are not disinterested in this matter, since you desire this sacrifice, it becomes something sentimental and irrational, and results in absurd errors which sometimes have disastrous consequences. So, a typical example is an Indian woman. Nowadays, Indian men also, well, husbands, women, all has become flat. So, but there was a time when, they would go to any extent of sacrificing themselves for the sake of the other. Family, parents, husband, wife, thinking that this is, by this we will grow. This is what they misunderstood as sacrifice. Forgetting that true sacrifice is the sacrifice to the divine presence and for the sake of the divine unfolding. So, sacrifice for the sake of sacrifice so that sometimes there is a very warped taste of the ego. See, I have sacrificed so much. That is sentimentality and it doesn't help. So, this she is making it very clear. Thus, consciously or not, instead of sacrificing yourself for the good of others, you sacrifice yourself for the pleasure of it, which is perfectly absurd and of no benefit to anyone. Have you noticed that, when somebody does something to you, or you do something for someone, and you have taken pains to do it, it comes in the process of doing something. Let's say you have made some food and you want to give it to someone out of joy and love. Now, supposing you tell the person, I woke up in the morning and took all the pains to make this food for you. Now imagine what will be the impact on the other person. So, or if you have to receive it like that, then it will be, in when we were young, sometimes parent, because in India this was very common, sacrifice for the sake of sacrifice. So sometimes parents would tell their children, when children grow up, what sacrifices we made for bringing you up, and we sacrificed our own food to feed you. Now, it becomes absolutely meaningless then. At one place, mother says, if you sacrifice, give something to the divine, and you remember it, then you have not sacrificed to the divine but to the vanity of your ego. That's it. So it brings no result, no purpose. So we have to understand this little change of motive. One is a sentimental movement for sometimes the sake of, satisfying a warped ego that takes pleasure in sacrificing for the sake of sacrificing. See, I have sacrificed so much. That's not what is demanded from us, and that's not a spiritual movement. It's a movement of the sentimental ego. So then she says, so what we should do when there is this sensitivity in people, not the detachment which is equivalent to the annihilation of the capacity to feel, but the detachment which brings about the abolition of the capacity to suffer. How beautiful it is. So one detachment is where you don't feel, it's okay, that person is suffering, it's his problem, her problem. I don't care. This is not what is being asked of us. What is being asked for us is something subtle, profound, very high. A detachment wherein we don't suffer, but we can help much better because we understand that suffering is a state of consciousness of acute egoism and ignorance. So you don't sit together and say, okay, now I am also suffering. Oh, our life is, there was at least one life in pain, other life was free now. I am also in pain, so two people, pain plus pain, multiplying each other. No. Instead of that, the capacity to rise above suffering and give the true solution. It's psychologically, you can see it when two people are quarreling. Unfortunately, one of the most common diseases, not regarded as disease. So when two people are quarreling, now one person starts getting angry. The second person also starts vibrating to the anger. So what happens? There is a storm. Now if one person is angry and even cursing, you're saying anything, the other person doesn't run away or says in anger, oh, I don't care. But he brings that peace within himself and applies that peace onto the other person. That is the solution. So you are not affected by that suffering, but you understand the suffering that is going on in another person and act upon it from a very higher poise. This is the way. By this you should understand that for the time being I am excluding insensitive people. Those who do not suffer because the substance they are made of is still too unrefined, too crude to feel, and those who are not even ready for suffering. So first stage is very crude, thick-skinned people who can't suffer. And they have a vicarious insensitivity to suffering of others. The second stage, when you become acutely sensitive, not to your own, but suffering in the world. And then you want to do something about it. But people rush into it and keep taking it upon themselves. That's not the way. First, develop that compassion, that light, that hope, that love, and then transmit it into the world. And then she gives the final solution. But of those who have achieved a high development of sensitivity, it can be said that their capacity to suffer is the exact measure of their imperfection. So though they have reached a high sensitivity, if they get caught in that vibration and start vibrating to it, so it's a sign of imperfection. So, what is the right way? She says, indeed, the expression of a true psychic life in the being is peace, a joyful serenity. A smile was her master movement. That's how it is described in Savitri. So, regardless of whatever happens, there is a smile. There is a smile of benevolence, smile of understanding, smile of compassion, which we can have toward the world. This is to cure in ourselves this attraction for suffering. We must understand the absurdity, the petty egoism of the various causes of our sufferings. So, it is not spiritual to start with. Some people take a vicarious joy, oh, I will do this, I will do that, and become a martyr, and at the end they add to their own agony and suffering, thinking they have done a great deed. They have not done a great deed. They have only fed their sentimentality and their ego of a warped kind. So, this is what is called as becoming a martyr. It goes to that extreme. And I have seen it in families. Somebody comes unannounced and you want to make food for everybody and you are paining yourself. That's not what is required, that to go to that extreme. Or somebody is ever unhappy with you for whatever reason and you keep on satisfying, keep on finding ways and means to satisfy the person so the person can be happy. That is not needed. It fails actually. One has to learn it by experience perhaps, but it fails. So what is important is you understand the real cause of suffering is this state of ego and ignorance in which one is caught. So get back to your own psychic poise, to higher poise. Apply it on the other person. Not run away, but apply it. Today or tomorrow that will have an effect. And to cure our excessive and ridiculous desire for sacrifice, too frequently for its own sake, regardless of any useful results, we must understand that if we are to remain in contact with all human sufferings through our sensitivity, we must also be vigilant and discerning enough to dissolve these sufferings as they come. To the clear sighted, they are purely imaginary. Most of the sufferings are purely imaginary. They're not, and you can be dragged in that world. And sometimes that's why the reactions or actions of a spiritual person may appear very hard-hearted, sometimes like indifferent. But that is because you realize that this is the real thing, you're not even seeing at the real thing. So she says that if you have the clear discernment, we will move in the world which is full of suffering. What should be our poise? With a psychic poise, benevolence, goodwill, compassion, love, yes. Light, yes. But not pity and that kind of getting caught and sacrificing one's own life and everything for the sake of so-called good. That's not good. For from this point of view, the only way to come to the help of men is to oppose to their suffering an immutable and smiling serenity. This is a state, huh? Don't think that if I keep smiling with the mouth, person may get very annoyed and more irritated. So that's not what it means. But an inner state of smiling serenity. Because you understand, it's like a child. What do you do when you see a child getting angry and throwing up? The child doesn't understand why things are happening. So what do? You don't start conceding to the child. You know that the child will be relieved. It's just a question of time. Be around, be there. But don't get caught into it. So, immutable and smiling serenity, which will be the highest human expression of impersonal love. So this is the other extreme, that on one side, one extreme is where we become completely selfish. This one extreme. The other side is in trying to become so-called unselfish. We start sacrificing our life absurdly, driven by pure sentiments, not with any higher aim or purpose, but simply to feed the sentimental ego within us and in the other person. The result is we suffer, the other person suffers, because that is not the cure for suffering. That's what she's saying. And suffering plus suffering becomes suffering to the level of 2, suffering square, quadratic equation. It's not 2 double suffering, it multiplies. So always keep that psychic serenity and meet this world. You will encounter and know its true causes is an ignorant attachment, A lot of it is imaginary. Even physical pain, lot of it is imaginary. It may sound again very psychological pain. Lot is imaginary. You have built a whole hypothesis around which you are leading your life. And therefore, people complain and grumble and they close the doors to grace. So instead of that, let us live in the calm, serenity, and joyous smile of the psychic being. And for that, let us find it and be one with it. Namaste.